Hello everyone and welcome back to our latest video. And in this video we are going to talk about key American cultural characteristics. So these are the cultural nuances that you're going to want to pay attention to when you arrive in the United States. And it doesn't matter if you're coming to do business, if you're coming to school, or if you're just coming for a visit to make some new friends. You're going to want to pay attention to these American characteristics so that you're going to know how to handle yourself when you interact with Americans. So we're going to go over several cultural characteristics today, and hopefully these will be helpful to you, and you can use them as you're traveling through the United States and interacting with many Americans. Okay, so the first characteristic that we're going to cover today is the concept of individualism. So America is what we call a very individualistic culture, which means that they see themselves as separate individuals who are different and separate from any groups that they may belong to, whether that's a group of other Americans or a group that consists of Americans and foreigners. The general belief tends to be that each person is an individual and each person has their own rights and their own individual freedoms. So this may contrast wildly from more traditionally group-based societies where the person's primary identity is focused on the group that they're in, the primary group that they're a part of. So when you come to the United States and you're from a group-based country, don't be too surprised when Americans speak of themselves more as individuals rather than as the group that they're a part of. So that's the first cultural characteristic that we want to take a look at. The second one has to do with the concept of privacy. Now, this is also related to the idea of individualism. Americans also value privacy a great deal. Now, what that means is that when work is over and we're done with the small talk and we're done with the socializing, a lot of Americans tend to keep to themselves. They go home and they spend most of their time with their immediate family, their wives or their husbands or their kids, and they spend most of the time just being with family and very close friends. This can be very different from other countries who are a little bit more group-oriented, who may spend a lot of time with more friends, more acquaintances, and they may spend more time with those people in addition to spending time with their immediate family members. So this is not to say that you can't ever get close to Americans or that Americans won't reveal personal details about their lives with you. You just want to be careful of not talking about topics that are too sensitive, such as, for example, politics and religion and things like that. You want to kind of keep separate, especially during the first several conversations when you're trying to get to know somebody a little bit better. So you want to stick to topics that are well established, such as the weather or sports or things like that. Those are good topics to talk about when you're meeting Americans for the first time. You don't want to talk about more sensitive issues, at least not right away until you get to know people a little bit more and they've come to trust you a little bit more. Then you can be part of their inner circle and you can start talking about those other topics then. So privacy is very important to Americans as well. Another thing that we want to touch on is the concept of equality. So Americans, since a very early age, they've been told from the Declaration of Independence, studying history in school, that all men are created equal. So Americans have a fundamental belief that it doesn't matter how old or young you are, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, what color your skin is, what socioeconomic background you're from. All men and women have an equal voice, and they're all entitled to express their ideas and their opinions, and they're all entitled to their own individual rights. Now, again, depending on the country you come from, this may be very similar, or it also may be quite different than what you're used to. So just know that when you come into the United States and you're doing business here, that equality is a very important cultural value amongst Americans. Another thing that surprises a lot of people when they arrive in the United States is figuring out just how informal Americans are in their speech patterns and also in their ways of addressing other people. So the notions of equality lead Americans to be quite informal in their general behavior and in relationships with other people, in particularly their bosses and their superiors at work. So people from societies where general behavior is more formal than in America are struck by the informality of the speech, the dress, and the posture. So Americans tend to use a lot of idiomatic speech, commonly known as slang, in their speaking, and that's heavily used on most occasions. And formal speech is usually only reserved for public events and very formal situations involving superior officers at work, or CEOs or things like that. So people of almost any station in life can be seen in public as wearing jeans, wearing button-down shirts with no tie. They have casual Fridays. Many companies do. In fact, a lot of companies just have business casual dress nowadays, just on normal days, let alone just Friday. So there's a big dependence on the concept of informality in the United States, and that may come as a surprise to many people who come from more formal societies where protocol is very much respected. Americans are also what we call very future oriented, so they tend to put a lot of focus on where they're going and where the country is going. So they think a lot about the future. In fact, I've heard a lot of Americans even tell me that history doesn't matter. It's the future that counts. So they look ahead in their lives, and they tend to try and avoid looking back. So a lot of countries, if you're coming from another country, you may be very surprised to hear this, especially if you're one that coming from a country that values tradition, or you're coming from a country that values being in the present moment rather than looking ahead to the future. It may be a little funny having to deal with Americans who are always thinking more from a future standpoint or from a future area. So another thing that is very important amongst Americans, and I get this a lot with clients of mine who are coming from other countries who want to know more about the American culture, this is the whole issue of time and punctuality in America. So for Americans, time is considered a resource. In fact, we have a saying here that's called "time is money." So you only get so much time in this life, so you better use it wisely. The future will not be better than the past or the present. So unless people are using their time for constructive and future-oriented activities, a lot of Americans will view you as wasting time. Furthermore, punctuality is very heavily stressed in the United States. So for example, if you have a meeting with your boss at 7 o'clock, you need to be at the office or at the meeting area at 7 o'clock. Not at 7:15, not at 7:30, but right at 7. So I know that in certain cultures, it's perfectly fine to be a little bit late, as much as 30 minutes late in some cases. But in America, you're going to want to try and avoid that. So if somebody says be here at 6:30, you need to make sure that you're there at 6:30. So punctuality is very highly valued, again, because Americans, they don't like to waste time. They want to make sure that every minute, every second of their time is being put to good use. So time is very important. One last thing that, and this is probably the most difficult for a lot of people from other countries to get used to, Americans are very direct and assertive in their way of speaking. So a lot of times Americans will just come out and they'll say exactly what they want. And they won't sugarcoat things. They won't try to use fancy language to make their position sound more formal or, a little bit more polite. Oftentimes they will just directly say exactly what's on their mind, and they will tell you exactly what they're thinking. So in other countries where a lot of people are used to being a little bit more formal or a little bit more tact, in America this could be a surprise. So you're going to want to get used to the idea of Americans speaking to you very directly. The key to remember here is not to get insulted or not to be offended because somebody is speaking directly to you. They're not trying to be rude to you. They're just doing things according to how they were taught in their culture. So it's good to just try to remember that as you're going through a conversation with an American, that sometimes they will be direct and assertive with you, and it's not to offend you. It's not to try and hurt your feelings in some way. It's It's just the culture. It's just the way things are here. So those are some key points to remember about American culture when you're here and doing business with Americans. So again, I hope that you found this information to be very helpful for you, and we will see you again in the next video. Thank you.